All right, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and let's kick this off. First of all, thanks to everybody for joining, especially Trevor Marshall, our presenter today. Many of you might know Trevor from his episodes, hosting episodes on Trainmaster TV or his podcast and website, the Model Railway Show. .com. But I'll turn it over here in a second to him, as he, I'm sure, can introduce himself better than I. I will be muting everybody here in a second, then I'll turn yours back on, or you can turn yours back on, Trevor. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in chat so we can pull them back all up at the end. We'll answer them then. But I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. And Trevor,
I'm unmuted, I think. Can
yep,
everybody hear me?
yes, you
I'm
are.
getting nods and thumbs up. All right. I don't see any band-aids on thumbs. You're all good modelers. Should I start then?
Yeah, go ahead. It's all
Okay, I'm
yours.
going to
It's all yours.
share my screen then, and let's see if it works. All right. Can everybody see that? Excellent. Okay. So, well, thank you everyone for joining me on, or joining us on a Sunday afternoon. Uh, I'm going to talk. Well, first, I should give a quick introduction. As I'd like to thank Chris for inviting me to speak, and Cal for putting the two of us together in the first place. Cal Sexsmith. Um, Cal is now local to me. 4 years ago, I moved from Toronto out to Saskatoon for family reasons, and I was fortunate enough to get in touch with Cal, or have Cal get in touch with me. And since then, we've built a small group that meets regularly for lunch and to solve layout problems and things like that. I document all of my most interesting stuff, I guess, on my website, which is themodelrailwayshow.com, which was the name of a podcast that I did a number of years ago. I actually stopped doing it in part because I was spending so much time with my co-host Jim Martin doing the podcast that we weren't getting any modeling done. So it was a good experience, introduced me to a lot of people, but then wanted to actually build something. Um, it's an unusual subject, talking about the Canadian National Railways in Southern Ontario, as you'll hear, and how I'm modeling them. I'm modeling an odd subject in an oddball scale. So I'm going to try to broaden out the topic to give you some insight into some of the layout design choices that I made, and some of the considerations I made when I was deciding whether I could do this at all. Um, I have talked about this before to some groups, but I have expanded and updated the topic. So if you've seen this before, you're going to see a lot of repeat material, but you're also going to see some new stuff. So please bear with me. Um, this is a quick look at what I'm going to cover. I'm going to tell you about the NS&T, tell you why I'm interested in it, give you an idea of what I've done so far on it, what I hope to do next, and then, as I said, to broaden it out, give you some tips on how I tackled a niche prototype in a niche scale. I'm also going to address some other things that I've done in my basement and leave you with some learning points. The place to start is why I'm modeling the NS&T. That's me as a kid. You'll see I'm holding an automobile, not a piece of railway equipment, but that changed pretty quickly. My first exposure to real railways wasn't stuff being pulled behind diesels. It was transit. I grew up in Toronto, the biggest city in Canada, fairly downtown. My parents didn't have a car because you didn't need one if you lived in a big city. It'd be like living in New York City and having a car. It'd be more pain than it was worth. And so we went everywhere by subway, streetcar, and bus. So this was really my first exposure to steel rails on steel wheels on steel rails. I'm kind of thrilled that Rapido has announced they're doing these red subway cars, and they should be coming out sometime next year. And yes, I've ordered a bunch, and no, I don't know what I'm going to do with them except enjoy them. A real nostalgic trip. Um, it's no surprise then that at a time when people were getting really interested in Appalachian coal hauling as a subject, I was more interested in what Bob Heggie was doing with his Crooked Mountain lines. Uh, this was the first sense to me that the streetcars that I was looking at could actually be more than that, that I could enjoy real railroading under wire. So I've collected all of the back issues of magazines with his articles in them, and I still look through them regularly for inspiration. Uh, in the late 70s, we moved from Toronto to St. Catharines, and there I discovered that the St. Catharines used to be the heart of an electric line that was a lot like the Crooked Mountain. It didn't go through mountains, but it did have a 300-foot Niagara escarpment to climb. It had freight as well as passenger services, as you'll see. The picture in the upper left is actually, all three of these pictures are on Ontario Street, which was the street that we lived on. And this was about two, maybe 3 blocks north of my house uh, when we moved there. I was going into, about to go into grade 7, I guess. And I lived there through high school. So very much in the impressionable era for modelers. You tend to model the thing that really captures you in your teenage years. So I would regularly see not the electrics; they were gone by the time I was there. But I would regularly see Canadian National Diesels running through the street, pulling freight. Uh, Louisa Street was important to me. This was the street I walked to high school. So every day, it's about a 7 block street between my house and high school. And every day I would run into one of the Canadian National switch jobs going over to Ontario Street to switch a General Motors plant. In the earlier era, it had passenger equipment running on it. This picture was actually done by Robert Sandusky of one of the railfan trips that happened in the 50s. But I used to walk by those houses and they're still there. Uh, so I guess the place to start is actually tell you a little bit more about the NS&T. This is the main car barn area that was just south of my high school and up until about 1960. And when I knew it, it was a strip mall with the grocery store we used to shop in, the barber shop where I got my hair cut, and one of the beer stores in St. Catharines. So sort of a central location in many ways. The NS&T, as the name suggests, Niagara St. Catharines and Toronto, it ran north-south in the eastern end of the Niagara Peninsula. So it's the red line on the map on the left, and the dashed line was lake boat service that would take people from the north end of St. Catharines from a place called Port Dalhousie across to Toronto. You could get at one time, you could get a steamboat from Toronto and get across the lake, pick up a dedicated interurban at Port Dalhousie that would take you over to Niagara Falls, and from there you could transfer over to railroads on the American side and continue down to New York City if you wanted. So on the map on the right is kind of small to see on the screen here, but the thing you need to note is the two things you need to note is first, the railway ran north-south through the peninsula, and in the process, it crossed several other railways that ran east-west. Again, if you look at the map on the left, it makes sense that most of the railways would be running east-west. They'd be going through from Hamilton, which was a major industrial center, through Toronto, which was a large place, through off to the further left, you would get to Windsor and Detroit, and then, of course, further on to Chicago. Companies like the Canada Southern and the Wabash used a shortcut through Ontario to shave time off their trips between Chicago and New York. Um, the trains that went across through there tended to be all sealed at the border with customs seals, and then had to be inspected when they got to Buffalo to make sure that none of the seals had been broken. So it was a real conveyor belt. They did, however, have some local stuff, and of course, Canadian National and the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo also ran east-west through there. So the role that the NS&T played was often as the last mile or first mile carrier, picking up and dropping off freight cars to and from industries located in the Niagara Peninsula. And the other significant thing that you can see in both of those, the blue line on the left is the Welland Canal, which connected Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. You can see it on the right map as well. The railway roughly paralleled the Welland Canal, and that makes a lot of sense because the canal, right from its inception, was a source of water power and transportation for heavy things like grain and lumber and coal and steel. And so there's a lot of heavy industry that was located along the NS&T in order to take advantage of the water power that was there. Um, and yeah, let's move on from there. So the NS&T was formed in 1889. It became part of the Canadian National under the Electric Railways in 1923. As you can see, CN started running buses, and of course that gradually took away all the passenger service. The freight service continued after 1960 as part of CN. The wires came down. CN started running diesels out of Niagara Falls, but still used the same line, which is how I encountered it in the late 70s and early 80s. CN pulled out of those lines in the 1990s, giving them over to a short line operator called Trillium, and parts of it are still operated today by a company called GeoRail. The GeoRail just shut down parts that were in St. Catharines, but there's still some operating down in the southern end of the peninsula, and they operate elsewhere in southern Ontario as well. But there's still a bit of the NS&T still being run today. So what did they run? They ran interurban and city services. The big red cars on the upper left there are the boat train that would connect at Port Dalhousie and take people to Niagara Falls. The city car down below obviously would go around. Mostly St. Catharines is where they ran those. They had some city services in Niagara Falls as well. I did a string diagram of the trains, and I was quite impressed that they, from 5 a.m. till 2 in the morning, they ran almost 100 trains per day. There's 96 trains on this sheet, but they're basically run by 4 train sets. You've got along the top there, you've got 2 sets of equipment running between St. Catharines and Niagara Falls, going through Thorold. And along the bottom, you've got 2 sets of equipment running from Thorold through Welland down to Port Colborne and back. So they managed to run a lot of passenger traffic at one time. This was taken from 1945, so it's still in the war years with gasoline rationing, things like that. So that's why all this service was there. They actually had to reinstate some services for the Second World War, and then this stuff very quickly disappeared. So but it shows you the kind of traffic that was there. The other thing, though, is that it wasn't just passengers. As I alluded to earlier, they ran express services. They had dedicated express cars, and they ran a lot of freight services as well. Even as you can see down through the middle of streets. Anybody from Canada will know at one time there was a famous hobby shop in Canada called Niagara Central Hobbies in St. Catharines. And if you look at that photo in the lower left, it was located about where that last boxcar is in that train. It's no longer there now, but it was one of the big ones. And I know it did do a lot of brass sales into the United States and around the world as well at one time. They ran a lot of freight services. Some of the books that I have on the line point out that at their height, they were probably moving about 400 freight cars a day. With multiple freight jobs covering that, and I'll get into that a little bit later. In addition to the trains, they ran the lake boats that I mentioned. The lake boats served two purposes: one, to take people across so they could get to Niagara Falls and onto the United States; the other, to take them to an amusement park up in Port Dalhousie, at the north end of St. Catharines, at the edge of Lake Ontario. The lake boats must have been a great experience, because it was about a 3-hour trip across the lake, I think. Today, you can get around the lake on the highway in about 70 minutes in the same time. But if you're driving on that highway, you're dealing with traffic. And if you were on the lake boat, you were dancing to a live dance band. So, maybe we've lost something in the quality of life in order to make things faster. But they had two lake boats that ran into, I think the last one ran into the 1950s before they stopped running those. CN did intercity and city bus services, and the Welland Avenue Car Barn in downtown St. Catharines was gradually taken over by the bus services. CN used it to repair buses for all of its transit lines in southern Ontario. Um, so that's sort of a quick overview of the prototype. I'm going to give you an idea of what I've done with it so far. The first thing I had to do was realize that this is a line that we would often hear when friends and I exhibited S-scale equipment at train shows. People love the size. It's a little bit bigger than HO, but it's not as overwhelming as O-scale. And they'd say, well, if I didn't have all this HO, well, I have a lot of HO still too, but uh, and if you are modeling an HO, you've got a leg up on everybody else, because stuff is available. You can think of a prototype, almost everything has been made. I know there are people who are going to say, well, yes, but what about? Uh, but on the other hand, if you're modeling in something like S scale, almost nothing has been made. So you have to make a plan. You can't just say, well, I'm going to do S scale and start at it. When I first got into S scale back in probably around 2010, 2011, uh, the first thing I did was determine what I wanted to model based on what key prototype equipment was out there, what structures I would need, what features and details I would have to have in order to have a satisfying layout. Then determine whether it actually been made, and if so, could I actually find it? Because one of the things we talk about in S is, a friend of mine, Chris Abbott, said S is for sorry. It means sorry, that's no longer made, or sorry, someone made that 50 years ago, but you can't get it anymore. So even if you know something is available, you have to be able to find it. Uh, then you have to determine what you need that isn't available, and if it isn't, can you actually make it? Are you ready to do that? Obviously, picking the right prototype helps. When I modeled Port Rowan, which was a Canadian National branch line in southern Ontario, I picked it primarily for two reasons. One, the prototype fit the space I had available, and two, I could get the key pieces of equipment that I needed to model that prototype. So I sort of approached this the same way when I decided I wanted to try building the NS&T in S scale. I was fortunate to acquire some uh, photo etched brass kits. They were more like scratch aids. They were the bodies, the photo etch for the bodies and the frames for some NS&T freight motors from a gentleman named William Flatt, who lives in southern Ontario. A few years ago, William was approaching his 80th birthday and realized he wanted to downsize. He had designed his own patterns to model the NS&T, which was a railroad that he had visited as a rail fan back in the 50s. And uh, of course, if you're anyone who's designed a kit for themselves, or designed something like photo etch, you're going to get more than one made in case you mess up the first one. You've got your backup. So William was a terrific modeler and did not mess up his models. So I was able to acquire his just in case kits. So the first thing I did was model three of the home built freight motors that the NS&T built in the Welland Avenue car barns around 1925. They use photo etched bodies. I've got dual power trucks under them. I think these ones came from Northwest Shortline or the Stanton drives. And I've put Lokesound V5 decoders in them with some files that when Matt Herman was still with Lokesound, he tweaked some files for me to get exactly what I needed for these. I've then built some, I didn't switch. Let's see if we can switch. There we go. I've built some more freight motors. The top two are Baldwin Westinghouse models. They were photo etched kits that came from Model Railroad Warehouse, which I acquired one of them several years ago, and the second one I found by going out and just asking around and seeing if I could find one. The two at the bottom are also wheel flat kits. The lower left is a General Electric, and the lower right was another. I'm sorry, no, it wasn't a home built. The lower right one was built for Ontario Hydro to help build the Queenston Power Canal, which parallels part of the Niagara River from Niagara Falls, and provides electricity for a lot of southern Ontario. One of the interesting things about modeling this line is when I look at the heavy industries, they don't have a lot of fuel being brought in by rail. You don't see huge lines of tank cars with oil or huge lines of hopper cars of coal because a lot of the big industries down there just use power generated by Niagara Falls. Once the power canal was built, they didn't need the locomotives anymore. They ended up in several places, including this one on the NS&T. So my first thing I needed to do was figure out whether I could actually build the locomotives. I did. The second thing I needed to figure out was whether I could actually build an electric layout. I've been a fan of these for years, but I've never actually built one. So I designed a small test layout. I thought I'll build the car barn area, or at least an interpretation of it. Because if it doesn't turn out, if I end up not liking doing this, I've at least got a nice display for all these lovely locomotives I've built. And if I do like it, then I've got the start of a larger layout. The spoiler is I do like it, so I've got the start of a larger layout. One thing though that I found was I really didn't like the overhead. I tried putting some overhead up. I strung some wire, just did the cross span. So if I go back here, you can see there are poles along the front edge of this layout and poles along the back. I just ran wires across those poles. I didn't put in any lengthwise, no running wire for the overhead. And I found every time I reached in to do something, there were wires in the way. I was constantly snagging on them. Then I realized that if I had full wire up, I would be trying to fix track or re-gauge something or resolder a wire through all of this overhead. And what this picture illustrates is that for me, it was I took a baking rack and I put it at about the level of where the wires would be. And it really becomes a cage between you and the models. And I didn't like that. It's not how I remember seeing electric railways when I grew up in Toronto, partly because I realized that when you're viewing a streetcar system, you're actually underneath the wires with the trains. You're not looking down through them, but on a model, you're looking down through them. And I just realized it would be more than I wanted to do. So I got rid of the wires. Instead of putting up proper wires, I basically put easy line across in a few places to offer the suggestion of it, and modified my trolley poles so that they only go up to the proper wire height when they're released off the hooks that hold them. I'm quite comfortable with this. Other people may not be and want to put the full wire up, but for an operating layout where I've got lots of freight cars, I think this is a compromise that I have to make. I suspect that during operating sessions, once I've got more of the layout built, I'm not even going to bother putting the poles up. I'll just put them up for photographs, because a lot of times on the prototype, if they were going back and forth, one of the crew would be holding the pole onto the wire, and they would be back poling anyway. So it's not like they changed the pole every time they changed direction. I mentioned earlier I built the car barn. That's the model of it. It's about 3.5 feet long. It's takes up almost 2 feet of depth on this piece of layout. It's all scratch built. I used brick sheet, cut down T-sheet windows, scratch built my overhead skylights and the doors, and tried to capture a part of the car barn, because if I was to model this in model the full barn in S scale, the building itself would be about 5 feet deep and 13 feet long. Just too large for what I needed. Would be a nightmare to maintain. And because I'm looking at modeling near the very end of the line's existence under wire, when most of the passenger service had disappeared, the car barn, most of the car barn had been taken over by bus services anyway, and looking after the buses. And that's all the stuff that would be at the back from this scene. Here we're looking south from Welland Avenue into the car barn area, and the south part of the building was all buses. So I don't need to model that. What you tended to see in photos of the prototype was this part of the car barn, this extension going off to the right, and then this odd little building in between the tracks. It's sort of a triangular shaped building. That's where they kept the sand for the traction. What do you call it, for the sand, the sand hoppers on the freight motors, just like diesels use sand for traction. They'd also have, I think the buses would take buckets of it as well in case they needed to sand over an icy patch. But that's what that odd little building is. Looking beyond the trains themselves, this was an exercise I did for Port Rowan. I've done it less so for the NS&T because I already know this stuff, but there are small suppliers of structures and details. There's less selection than in other scales. It really is a case of S is for scratch building. So what you see in this scene, most of what's in here is either a heavily modified kit or a scratch built. The red building in the back was a station on my last layout. I scratch built that. The tree is scratch built as well. The exception in S scale is vehicles. There are a lot of die-cast vehicles. It's a popular scale for that, so that gives me a good place to start. In this case, Husband Transport was a Canadian southern, as you can see by the labeling on the side, Southern Ontario into Quebec transportation company. These decals, this truck originally started as a recessed peanut butter collectible, so it was yellow and orange and had a peanut butter cup on the side of it. I painted over it and put on actually HO scale decals from Black Cat decals, and they fit nicely on this truck. I don't know how they would fit on an HO truck, but it worked out quite well. I have two funny stories about this. First of all, I would take this truck to put on the S-scale workshop layout at shows. I had a lot of people come up and say, oh, that's where they transport the husbands. They figured that there were probably lazy boy chairs and a beer cooler inside. Uh, more more interesting though, I had a woman come up to me at a show one time and say that her father had worked for Husband Transport, and she gave me some stories about just brief high level stories about his experience working for Husband. He was an executive for them out of Montreal. So it shows that if you take a little bit of an extra effort, if you're exhibiting something, to try to put something on that is real as opposed to and relevant to what you're modeling, as opposed to just grabbing a truck and putting it on. I wouldn't have had the same conversation if it had still been a Reese's peanut butter cup. The other thing that I found with S scale is borrowing from other scales helps. In the upper left, I've got some HO scale corn. It's just a month earlier in the growing season. At the right, if you look in, you can see there's a red-winged blackbird on one of the flowers in there in that meadow. That was marketed as an HO scale item, but it actually works better in S scale. And down in the lower left, this is a tobacco kiln where they cure the tobacco from from my last S-scale layout. The conveyor is a Walther's HO scale coal conveyor, which I used parts from and kit bashed the conveyor belt itself to make it a little wider. So finding if you're looking at something at a niche scale, uh, seeing what you can use from other scales is really an important first step. So where I am with it today, I've built 7 freight motors out of brass kits. I've built the car barn. I've built the sand house. I've thrown down some scenery. I've got some fake wire overhead. And this is all on a 2 by 8 foot module that forms sort of the nucleus of my ambitions for the NS&T. Having a look at what's next after they get this. This is one of the excursion runs that was organized by a historical association before the wires came down. They're obviously having a little bit of problems with with things staying on the track here. Something that we can all relate to, I'm sure. As I say, I finished building the freight motors that I need. I'd like to build some non-revenue equipment. I have, as you can see down the lower left, talented modeler named Bill Sharp, built an HO scale model of an NS&T line car. And I have that article out of RMC, so that gives me a starting point on a line car. I'd like to build a sweeper. I have an HO scale model of the sweeper at upper right, which gives me a good starting point for measuring off. I've got some basic dimensions. I've also, as I've been working on the NS&T, I've collected the things I need, like the side frames and the detail parts, the headlights, the retrievers, all the little things that you need to put something together. And so I'm basically down to forming some bodies and doing some drilling and gluing. I'd also like to build some excursion equipment. The NS&T was very railfan friendly, and these 2 cars were used a lot for excursions. The car at the back, Will Flatt, who did the freight motors, did a photo etch for this, and I have that plus the parts to finish it. I just haven't gotten around to doing it. It's been a low priority. The car at the front, he has not gotten around to doing. But I have collected all the parts I need for it. I just need to scratch build the bodies, and I've got plans for that as well. I think the excursion equipment is a nice way to remind people of the heritage of it, that it wasn't strictly a freight line, while not overwhelming the layout with stuff that I frankly can't get, and that isn't as maybe as interesting to operate as the freight jobs will be. The other thing I need to do is plan a larger layout. So this is a quick drawing of my my basement. I am standing at the bar right now over in the lower right. My workspace where I earn my living is up in the upper right. And then the rest of it is devoted to trains, which sometimes means working's kind of hard because I can look up and see something I'd rather be doing than making a living. The little blue square, obviously, that's a 2 by 8, just to show you the relative size of the car barn scene and the space I'm working with. I drew a plan about a year ago and started looking at building this. Uh, but I'm not building this, and I'll explain why. You can see I've got the car barn up in the upper left corner, and then there's a spot called Niagara Street along that long wall, which is represents the big freight house that was in St. Catharines. And then down along, coming up the middle of the room, we've got a place called Meriton, which was a big interchange yard with the Canadian National. So this is where all the cars came in and out to the area. Things I liked about it, it was really designed for operations. It would have kept all 7 of those freight motors busy because there were transfer runs to various places that I could stage. There were switchers building trains. There were proper trains going out onto the various divisions, which in this case would be going to staging and coming back. It could have kept a lot of people busy. That was one of the problems with it. I found as I looked at it that there was just too much track on it to the point where it was crowding out any sort of context. One of the things I really liked about my Port Rowan layout was that the trains were in the scenery as opposed to being trains from fascia to backdrop. The full operation would have required far more people than I know in Saskatoon. As I mentioned to a couple of people when we're getting started, I know Cal Sexsmith, and I know a couple of other people who aren't part of the LDSIG, but we're trying to get them involved, I think. But that's a group of four, and that's pretty good. We get along well. We share ideas. I think it would be fun to run trains with these guys. We've run trains over at Cal's place. I don't need to have, and I don't want to have a layout that requires a dozen people or 2 dozen people to operate. And I think that the layout I designed would have probably required 8 to 12, and it was just too many. The other thing is that it filled the space and left no other room to explore other interests in the hobby, and I have a lot of those. So uh, I've designed a second layout, which I'm currently reviewing. It has it takes up less of the space. You can see I've labeled something called the long wall. I'll talk about that in a minute. It also has more signature scenes from the NS&T on it, although not necessarily in the right order. I'm not as concerned about having things in the right order as I am being able to look at a specific vignette and say, yes, that's what I see in the books that have been done on the NS&T and things like that. And the fact that it's not in the right order is largely due to the nature of the prototype. That it's the track plan. If I wanted to do it as a prototype, would be find the largest spider I could get and smack it with a hammer, and then just model all the legs going everywhere, because that's how the prototype was. It had tendrils out through all of St. Catharines, and it just does not fit into spaces that for us are usually more linear. So I mentioned, let's let's try that. There, I mentioned signature scenes. One of them is the Geneva Street Terminal. This was built in 1925 at the east end of the city. It became the head offices. I love that picture of the two-car passenger train going between the trees. That's something I really want to model. I've got this odd-shaped space in one corner where I can actually stick the terminal in, because it is a triangular-shaped location. They didn't use this very much because it quickly became apparent that nobody could get out to the terminal from the downtown, so it really wasn't convenient. Eventually, it became a bank building and a trade school for teaching people to type and do stenography, things like that. And it's now been torn down, but I have lots of pictures of it to work from. Another, I mentioned the freight house. Freight houses and team tracks are great because you have a variety of equipment. I've got a couple of very blurry pictures of the freight house, which is N on my little diagram there. Uh, the nice thing here is that there is a kit made several years ago in S scale for a typical Canadian national style freight house, which is close enough to get me that brick building at the start, and then I can just build the sheds off the back of it. Another signature scene that shows up in a lot of pictures was the overpass over the Canadian National at Meriton. This is where the NS&T went from St. Catharines to the south part of the peninsula. It had two different styles of bridges over its life, and I'd like to put that, at least one of them in. I'd probably do the nice through truss there, although to get started, maybe do the girder and see how it goes while I figure out how I'm going to scratch build the through truss. Um, this does give me a place to show off some of my old CN equipment from Port Rowan, and also tell a bit of the story of the NS&T, that it was a subsidiary of the Canadian National and got its equipment from or got its interchange from CN primarily. As you can see in the little diagram there, the bridge I'm calling F, with the dark tracks under it being CN, the blue track would be the NS&T, and that track that swoops off to the upper edge of that little segment of the track plan goes to a little interchange yard, which would represent Meriton and give me a place to actually start and end traffic on and off the layout. Another signature scene, I like this. It's a lovely little station in Font Hill, which is sort of halfway along the line between the two lakes. That's at L in this. The dash line that I've got the K inside is one of the substations. And so you can see the substation in the back just to the right of the boxcars in that picture. I think that's important, doing an electric line to sort of remind people where it came from. It's a nice opportunity to do a scene. Um, Jay in this scene is a company, a tool maker called Warren Pink, who is actually up in St. Catharines. I'm going to move it down into this scene because I just adore this picture of the guys on the steeple cab and the lovely brick building with all those windows. So that's another scratch building project for me. I also like the little bit of variation in the grade there between the main track going past in the front and then a slight rise to the spur that the engine is on. So, still under development on this. Ironically, the two things I have right now are the car barn scene and the sector plate, which came from Port Rowan. And I don't really like the way this scene, as drawn, is shaped. I find that it just doesn't feel right visually. It kind of interrupts the flow of trains. I think maybe I've thrown the sector plate up on the wall because I had it and thought this is a quick win in terms of building the layout, but I don't really need it there because the interchange with CN would be on a peninsula coming up in the middle of this space, and the sector plate is just sort of superfluous. So my plan at this point is to ditch the sector plate, move this car barn around the corner, and then add another signature scene in where that car barn is currently. I mentioned and you can see there just before I get onto the long wall, the interchange area that I was talking about is that long bit of peninsula sticking up in the middle of the room. Um, so I left on purpose. I left this wall blank because, as I mentioned with the first version of my layout plan, it was really too much layout, and it didn't leave me room to pursue some of my other interests. So I've actually, ironically, while I started on this, I've made more progress on a completely different layout, which is a British O scale 7mm layout based on the Great Western Railway in the late Edwardian era, around 1905. It's an era of locomotives with open cabs and brass domes. It's an era in which the freight cars were barely bigger than a wagon that a horse-drawn, team of horses would pull. Why am I doing this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, down in the lower right is a small exhibition layout built by a friend of mine in Ontario, an O-scale layout that I helped him exhibit on a number of occasions and really enjoyed working in something different. I ended up buying the little tank engine that's on the left in around 2016 or so, and said someday I'll have a place to run it. So now the piece that you see up on the top there is what I'm working on. My interest in British Railways goes back a long way. Having grown up in downtown Toronto, in Canada as part of the Commonwealth, we actually had quite a lot of interest locally in British railroading. And also there was a real not bias towards it, but if you wanted to find uh, model railroading stuff in the 60s and 70s, it was a lot easier to find British inspiration than it was to find North American in downtown Toronto. And the reason for that, in the upper left there, that's me as a kid with some of my British O-scale battery-powered trains. Uh, the big department stores would bring these in from the United Kingdom every year at Christmas, and my parents would buy some part to expand onto my set. So one of my very earliest exposures to the hobby was through British trains as opposed to North American. The other thing was that for at the time, the only place I could find a model railroader or an RMC was at a hobby shop. And to get to a hobby shop without a car in Toronto was a full day adventure on the bus. So it happened a couple of times a year. But if I wanted a British magazine, I could go to any main street and go to any smoke shop, and there seemed to be one about every 3 blocks. And I think the smoke shop and magazine, they'd sell pipe tobacco and magazines. They would get a batch of magazines, and what they really wanted was country life and the British gossip magazines and the British newspapers. And in order to get that as a package deal, they also had to take Railway Modeler and Continental Modeler and a bunch of British train magazines and other special interest magazines. So I ended up getting a lot of British magazines as a kid. Later on, I discovered Model Railway Journal, which is still in print, and it's a fantastic magazine about fine scale modeling. It is all British subjects, but it really shows off some top flight modeling. And then, of course, the gentleman in the upper right, if you're a member of the LDSIG, you probably recognize him as Ian Rice. I've always been intrigued by his layout designs. He did do a number of designs for North American for Comback. They tended to be more of a British style model railway with a North American theme, so they tended to be sometimes packed a little more tightly than we do here, because the reality is we have more space than in the UK. But I have also picked up a number of his British design books and find they're full of really interesting ideas, lots of emphasis on proper lighting, on valences, and not just putting up a valence, but having it come out from the edge of the front edge of the fascia. So as you can see in the lower left, the layout I'm building, uh, I'm trying to adopt some of his best practices and put them on that layout. Now, there is actually a connection between these two. When I got my NS&T freight motor kits, the photo etches, I realized that I had no opportunity to mess them up. I couldn't go and get another one because they just didn't exist. Uh, I was worried about the quality of my soldering, and having been exposed to British railway modeling, I knew that the British modelers or the British manufacturing space had a lot of photo etched brass kits. I figured that they would be well designed because they have been doing this for so long that they will have gotten it right, and the poorly designed ones would no longer be available. I knew that a 19th century wagon that had very rudimentary brakes and no other safety appliances on it would be relatively simple in terms of the number of parts in them. And I knew that if I messed it up, I could always get another one. So I looked around, I found a supplier named Wasal Model Industries, and I've since built about 20 kits of all different types. The weird little thing in the lower left is what's known as a lighting gas car. Uh, they used it to transport uh, lighting gas to remote stations, so they could fill the reservoir for the stations for the platform lights, and also so they could fill the tanks on branch line passenger trains on the cars for the gas lighting in the cars. Uh, that all started, as you can see on the right. It's not the same kit, but that's basically what that kit looked like. There's several sheets of flat photo etch. I had to roll the tanks and solder them together. There's a few white metal bits like the tank ends, but it's largely done with layers and layers of brass. So I won't say I'm great at photo etch, but I'm much better than I was. And I got to the point where I could actually build my NS&T freight motors with confidence. So that was sort of the intersection between those. Of course, once I had 20 freight cars done for the UK, I really needed a layout to put them on. I also find from a layout design perspective that having two different layouts that are so different gives me lots of variety in terms of things like how the couplers work. This O-scale British layout uses 3-link couplings, which means you have to be able to couple up and uncouple everywhere. It changes how you operate even, because delayed uncoupling is built right in. You never have to mess with that kind of thing, but you need terrific access. Uh, Switch control was done in the UK commonly with a ground frame, which is similar to what we would have with an interlocking tower. So there was a centrally located frame that had big levers on it, and then there was lots of piping that went out to the switches, to the track switches. that changes the operating roles. In a North American layout, if you're doing on the NS&T, the crews will largely be throwing their own turnouts. Uh, in When we run trains on the British layout, which we've done a couple of times now, one person basically is going to be in charge of the of throwing the switches, and the engineer will have to give him a whistle code to say, "I want a switch thrown." Uh, the layout of a typical British country station involves a basically team tracks and freight houses versus having private online customers. The type of paperwork that you use, instead of having waybills or switch lists, you've got these little things called wagon tags, which actually were little pieces of paper that were put into holders on each wagon so that the person could see uh, see where the car was supposed to go. And the use of not only having an interlocking frame, or having a ground frame to control the switches, but the fact that switches were interlocked so that certain things had to be done in certain orders and signals had to be given to allow trains in and out of a station changes a lot about how an operating session works. So it's been interesting having experience with two very different styles of approaches to prototype railway design and modeling them. Uh, so some of the lessons that I've learned, I've just put these out in a big sheet, but I won't read them out entirely. But determining minimum requirements if you're going to do something in a niche scale, that is essential before committing to it. Um, Finding out what people are doing in other scales or with other prototypes can open up some new avenues for learning. I never would have gotten the skills that I have for doing brass if the British modelers hadn't embraced photo etched kits the way they have. Um, Before building a layout, I find now that I'm assessing designs in terms of the time it's going to take and the number of people I want in to operate it and what that experience is going to be like. And that seems to to me, it's become more important than actually the placement of individual uh, tracks and buildings and things like that. So it's that sort of that taking a step back from the layout itself and thinking about how you want to engage with the hobby. Um, Also for me, it was one of the things the NS&T forced me to do was focus on signature scenes and not worry so much about them being presented in the correct order. And part of that was having looked at there's 4 books on the NS&T. Having looked at the pictures, there were things that attracted me about them. And when I'm reading those books, I have an idea of where those places are now, but I never really care as I'm enjoying those pictures that the pictures stand on their own. They don't have to be in order to work for me. And finally, for me, I've realized after many years in the hobby that having a single space filling layout is not necessarily my best option. I need the variety. So even though I'm carving out something from the NS&T in order to do the Great Western, I'm really enjoying that. And finally, your mileage may vary because what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. The important thing uh, is to ask yourself those questions. So before I go, or before I wrap it up, this has bothered me since I got interested in the NS&T. There aren't a lot of prototype-based traction layouts out there, and there are a lot of model railways where people are building exquisite models of traction equipment, but they're not building a prototype-based model railway the way that people who model steam or diesel do. They tend to have they tend to be more focused on the model of the equipment and less on the model of the railway. So um, they look like a museum, or they are just a place to run and enjoy the trains. And they can have very lovely scenes in them. They can have lovely street scenes with buildings and street lighting and automobiles and people and all the stuff you'd expect in an urban area. But they have a mix of equipment, and it's really just a place to enjoy running them. Uh, I find it odd because there are so many interesting prototypes that could be modeled. I've listed just a few of them here, but I'm sure if almost everywhere in North America had stuff running under wire at some point. Um, and I've noticed as I go through the NS&T that the trains are shorter, they're more frequent, they are obviously curves can be tighter, switches can be tighter. There's a lot of advantages compared to to modeling a traditional steam or diesel layout. So there's plenty of interesting prototypes, even in the case of the Iowa traction, something that's still running. Um, the only layouts I know of that model these types of railways faithfully are first the Grand River, Lake Erie, and Northern lines in southern Ontario. These were Canadian Pacific electric lines that model Roger Chrysler is modeling in HO scale. If any of you were on the 2003 NMRA convention LDSIG tour, you would have seen Roger's layout. Uh, so that's quite a ways back. He's since moved and he's building a new one, but same subject. And then my friend William Flatt, who started the NS&T in 1 to 64 and is where I got my equipment from. Those are the only ones I can think of. Um, so that is, I think, yes, that's it. I am open to take questions. And if you want to see more of what I'm doing, themodelrailwayshow.com is the place to find stuff about the NS&T, the Great Western, and various other projects that I work on. So thank you. I'm glad you could join me.
Thanks a lot, Trevor. If you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And I think we had a few on the chat. Travers, I think you had the first one on there. You there, Travers?
Maybe I answered it.
You're on mute, Travers. There you go. You should be good now.
And the chat was, did other railways use cross Canada sealing the for customs like the PM and New York Central?
Okay. I'm not really sure. I know those two did for sure because of the nature of where they went. Oh yes, actually, I think the Canadian Pacific International Main Division did as well, which would have taken um, would have run freight trains from Quebec, from Montreal, basically down to Halifax in Nova Scotia to the Atlantic Ocean. But instead of going up over the top of Maine, they shot through the middle of it. So I'm sure that those trains would have had seals on the doors as well, custom seals.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Bruce, I think you had a question.
Trevor, you showed us a couple of designs in your basement.
Yep.
And I was just curious what program you were using to draw the designs.
I am using pencil. And so it's the 2B program. I'm old school, so I use pencil and then tend to color it in with. I've got a nice pack of Stapler markers and color in various things with that. So very old school.
So you don't use a template when you're using your pencil? Or
No, I've drawn so many that I probably draw turnouts oversized, so I'm never disappointed. What I tend to do when I'm designing something is get a sketch on pencil, and then before I commit to the plywood, I will roll out a big roll of craft paper. I will take full-size turnout templates off the Fast Tracks website, because I tend to use Fast Tracks turnouts anyway, and I will lay it out full size on
craft paper?
on craft paper. Yeah.
Okay.
And that allows me to check clearances, confirm that a building will fit. I do a lot of adjustment at that stage. It helps that most of what I model now, or most of the layouts I plan, are generally big shelf layouts, so the 2-foot width works well. For the peninsula, I may be a little bit in this current NS&T layout, I may be a little bit deeper in places, so I'll have to tape some paper together. But I'm also fortunate that I've got a lot of space to work in, including a spot where I've got a couple of big tables set up so I can roll craft paper out. And
Thank you.
and it's kind of like building a large modular layout. I might be dealing with my British layout that I'm working on is 24 feet long, but I only draw the craft paper, of course, is in a 100-foot roll, and so I just roll out 8 feet, work on that, and then roll that bit up and move it over and roll out the next 8 feet and work my way along. So,
Yeah. Thanks.
How do you transfer the plan from the paper to the homicide or whatever your road bed is?
the full size paper.
Yeah.
I roll it out on top of the plywood and then tape it down and work from there. So I can slice through it and then run a marker line if I want a center line for something. Sometimes I will do that, and then I will print out more turnout templates and just tape them right down to the road bed and build over top of them, because the thickness of a piece of paper isn't going to really change the quality of the road bed. So
Do you glue the paper template down, the turnout template?
yeah, I can. I tape it down to start, and then I will sometimes roll some glue underneath it and lift one end of it, put some glue down, and then spread it out. Yeah, once I'm happy with it.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions out there? Go ahead and unmute yourself. Trevor, I'm just curious, since I've never looked at a few S scale, but on there, what were the radiuses, kind of going around the corners of?
Well, for an S scale steam layout, I would look at my last one. I used small steam like 260s and 460s, and I did 42-inch radius, and that worked. Passenger cars looked a little odd on it because it was a little bit tight. I would have gone with 48. Because I'm doing a traction layout this time, I'm doing 36, and that's actually looser than a lot of the prototype places on the NS&T, but that will comfortably handle a 50-foot car in S scale. So it'll handle the longest freight equipment I'm going to use. The passenger cars, of course, are their traction, so they're used to going around. I don't know, they probably do a 5-inch radius or something because they're traction, right? I think they're made out of rubber and they just bend in the middle. But I'm using 36, and then I've drawn the plan with number 7s and number 9s for the turnouts, because that was a fairly standard Canadian national size. And this was, despite it being under wire, it had started as a freight railroad as well as passenger. It became an important freight carrier very early on. So there were a lot of places on it that were done to steam road standards.
Are there any other questions?
Anybody, I did have that question. Anybody have any thoughts on what's holding back traction as a viable option for people? Is it availability of equipment, or like I expected that there would at least be people remotoring those Soydam Pacific Electric engine freight motors and traction and doing something with them. I know one person who is, but I'm kind of surprised that more people don't look at it as is it a fear of the overhead? Is it a lack of product? I don't know.
I think it's the fear of the overhead. For a long time, I considered doing the Avery, Idaho.
Yeah.
Not far. It's not far from where I live, and obviously that was the transition from electric to diesel at that location, and you know, doing the overhead and doing it right. Is it going to get in the way? Um, but I think that's a thing, and I think you made the right compromise in the sense that you said, well, I'm not going to let the wires get in the way. And you know, I've seen a couple Milwaukee Road layouts that, you know, done with wire and without, and you know, with the wire you can't touch anything. You don't.
Yeah.
They weren't doing operations, and but without, you know, it was different.
If you
And
put
it still
the
had the look.
if you put the poles up and put, as I say, easy line is a great choice, because if you accidentally wang into it, it stretches out of the way and snaps back. And if it does eventually fail and break, well, you just string some more. But um, I didn't want, when I started putting the wires up and realized what a hassle it was, I didn't want my friends coming over to run trains and feel uh, intimidated by the wiring, in terms of, oh, am I going to stick my hands into it and you know, make it look like the cat's been into the yarn, kind of thing. And because above all, I want anything that I do that is going to involve other people to present as a comfortable environment for running trains together. And because of that, the overhead was a compromise I was willing to make.
I
Yeah,
think it's also,
Bruce, you have something? Oh.
Yeah, just an answer for Trevor. We had a modeler here in California. I'm near Santa Barbara, and we had a modeler here that modeled in O scale. And he modeled every single class of electric locomotive ever made or even planned. And he had models of each one of them in O scale. Interesting technique. He built them out of cardstock.
Okay.
But he ran them under wire, and he had a fairly large O scale layout up in an upper room at his house. Some of the models were displayed at the California State Railroad Museum for a while. There's a famous restaurant in downtown Los Angeles near Union Station called Felipe's, and some of his models were there in the restaurant. And I think most of his stuff ended up going to the Southern California Railroad Museum, which is down in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Is basically a museum for electric railroads.
Right.
But yeah, his name was Bill Everett, and
Oh, I've seen some of his stuff. Yes.
it was an incredible layout. I've got personal pictures that I've taken. Bill was a pretty close friend, so. But you're right. There's not a lot of electric railroad layouts out there.
And he did a lot of Pacific Electric, if I recall.
Yes, he did. But that was pretty obvious since we live in Southern California.
Sure.
But my favorite story is that he modeled this one electric car that was designed for the railroad in Honolulu.
Okay.
And they had plans for it. They never built it. But Bill built one, and it was exquisite. It was really a nice model, but
Yeah, no, I remember his work appearing in MR a couple of times. He
yes,
did some things on his
exactly.
layout, and it was, and his layout is what I typically think of when I think of people modeling under wire. He did a beautiful job of it, but it was primarily, if I recall, a working diorama, a place to showcase his beautiful models, as opposed to being, I'm going to model the Pacific Electric and I'm doing this particular part of it from, you know, from here to there kind of thing, right? And uh, and I'm modeling the timetables and all the things that people who are designing operations oriented, sophisticated layouts for steam or diesel tend to take as a matter of course. I don't see that happening a lot with electric. And
You're right on with Bill's layout. It was basically a big oval of track, and he just ran the models round and round. He had some beautiful buildings, but it wasn't a particular spot. It was for any of his models. And
yeah,
I have some association with another organization, the Operations Special Interest Group, and that's what we're looking at is operations. And designing to operations is I think the best way of doing things. Bill was, like you said, building a diorama to show off his models.
and it's absolutely a valid way to do it, and it's beautiful. And if I had his talent, I might do that myself. Just set him up and watch him go. But I just find it's an odd hole, because one could model something like the Iowa traction system. The material is the freight cars are all out there. The freight motors were available through Model Railroad Warehouse's kits, and it would be similar to what Lance Mindheim does with the CSX in Miami, that kind of thing. It would be a terrific subject for a prototype-based switching layout. It would just happen to be of an electric subject.
I think that maybe the reason for the dearth of traction is that it was unfamiliar to so many people in their teenage formative years. You grew up in Toronto and saw all that, but many of us didn't see that. And
that's true. Yeah, that's true. And Toronto was unusual because at a time when most of the traction or the streetcar lines were being removed from cities, Toronto hung on to theirs. And now we're seeing a renaissance of that type of public transit in places. And there are lots of cities in North America rebuilding their essentially what used to be their streetcar system. And Toronto just never got rid of theirs. So yeah, I was exposed to it in the 60s and 70s in a way that other people living elsewhere would not have been.
And then you have the B&O who started with overhead and decided that wasn't working for them and went to outside third rail. And you also have that for the New York Central around New York City was outside third rail.
I think one of the other big barriers, and for you, it sounds like you very much enjoyed this part of it, is the entry level to building your own locomotives or engines.
Well,
and
that's
I think that's for a vast majority of people. That's a jump they don't want to take.
I think that's as much a factor of modeling in S scale as it is modeling track. My Canadian National equipment, my CN steam equipment in S scale, was all hand built by a guy in Montreal who's an absolute wizard with brass, and I could not have modeled the CN in S scale without him, because I'm still not ready to model. There are lots of kits available from the UK for British steam engines, and I'm not yet ready to tackle one of those.
Trevor, great job. You really did a super presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank you. Thank you again. I really appreciate it, and it was very informative for me, at least. I got your slides. Your slides didn't change any from what you sent me.
I think I did a couple of minor tweaks, but
Okay.
there's nothing in them that doesn't work in what the deck I sent you. So.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank you very much for your time and everybody for joining. Thank you, Trevor. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thanks for putting up with an obscure subject for an hour and a half or whatever we are here, hour and a quarter. So, all right.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
And
Thank you
if
very much.
anybody if anybody has any follow-up questions, you can find me on my website. And there's a contact form on the website for how to reach me if you want to get in touch. So,
Yep.
okay.
And I will actually put your link in chat right now. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.